show. Keep the adventures alive.
Tonight's episode of CANOEHOUND'S Outdoor Adventure Show is brought to you by Kid Products, stick stoves and reflector ovens proudly made in Canada. Algonquin Outfitters, with 5 key locations in and around Algonquin Park to serve your backcountry needs. Salis Marine, keeping you safe on the water since 1999. Ostrom Outdoors, custom fit canoe packs and barrel harnesses. And Novacraft Canoes, connecting you with nature in Canadian-made canoes since 1970.
Well, hello, happy Tuesday evening, and welcome back to another episode of CANOEHOUND'S Outdoor Adventure Show. My name is Dennis, also known as CANOEHOUND. If this is your first time tuning in with us tonight, well, thanks very much for joining us. We got a show coming up here that's going to be very educational, something you can take to the bank as far as knowing what to do in the backcountry if you come across any invasive species, which there are a great number of. But before we do get on with tonight's guests, we have 3 of them tonight that will be joining us. And we're just going to get along here with a few of our announcements, as we always do, while the chat over there builds in for any latecomers. I just want to say this week I had a comment from a viewer, and it's one that I fielded a couple times, and it was about the announcements that we have at the beginning of the show. You know what? It's been a format that we've had pretty much since we started this show, and it's something I'm probably going to continue to do because this is a way for me to connect with people in a little different way than just with what's going on with the show. But also, it gives, in all fairness, an opportunity for people to get themselves into the chat, get themselves situated. And you know what? We spread a bit of joy there when it comes to announcements and stuff like that, of good joy with birthdays and anniversaries and such. So we're going to continue to do that. Sorry to the fella that was rather disappointed with it, but I'm sure if you enjoy the rest of the content of the show, just jump ahead in a replay, 10 minutes, and you'll be good and golden, ready to go. Anyways, last week, happened to miss last week's show, we had Dave Johnstone, the canoe collector, on. And we shared all kinds of really good stories, talked about some of his love for the French River. Talked about a lot of his canoeing experience that he has, and we also chatted about just canoes in general, as far as the makeup of canoes, characteristics, some old canoes that he's had throughout his collection throughout the years, and it was a really fun show. So if anybody happened to miss that, you can feel free to go back into our past episodes playlist. That is available there for anybody to watch, and also if you can't watch it on YouTube, well, it's now available as well on YouTube Music as a podcast. Just look up CANOEHOUND Adventures on there, and you'll be right in there. Anyways, next week's show, just to give a little announcement there, it's always a favorite throughout the seasons of CANOEHOUND'S Outdoor Adventure Show is our winter camping episodes. So next week, we're going to be talking about that. It's going to be our annual winter camping show, and we are just going to be giving all kinds of tips on gear, ways to stay warm, different places that you can camp, especially if you are a beginner, because there are some ways that you should go about it to make sure that you're safe. That's the main thing. Wintertime is a little bit of a different animal when it comes to camping, and you want to make sure you're doing it safely and comfortably. You want to be able to enjoy these experiences. So make sure you tune in next week. If you want to get a little bit of a precursor, you could always go back into past episodes too. I think this is going to be our 4th annual winter camping episode. So take a look into that. Let's see here. One of our sponsors, Ostrom Outdoors. They've got a rather good sale going on right now. It's our good friends Bill and Ann Ostrom. Make some fantastic packs and barrel harnesses. Well, you know what? With Black Friday coming up, they have I believe it's 15% off of a bunch of the products that they have on their website. So if anybody's, looking for a great gift for a loved one, or hey, maybe you want to treat yourself to a nice bomb-proof, well, I'll call it bomb-proof backpack, something that's very well manufactured, very comfortable to wear, check out Ostrom packs, Ostrom Outdoors. You know what? You won't be disappointed, and at least give them a shot. Have a look at it. But there's some great savings to be had there right now. 15% off. It's a really good deal. Really good deal. Another cool announcement. I was at the Barrie show a few weeks back, and I met up with a representative from a company that I guess is the distributor for Motorola. Motorola is coming out with a new satellite GPS unit, one of the safety beacons similar to, we'll call it the InReaches and the Spot and the Zolios. They're coming out with the Motorola Defy, and that actually hits the market in Canada here on November 20th. So for anybody who might be in the market for a very lightweight, thin, and durable device for, back when you're traveling in the backcountry, just for that safety and peace of mind, you might want to just add that to the list of products that you're going to be looking into. It's the Motorola Defy. Check it out. It's really cool. It's really thin. And one thing, one of the features that I kind of like about it, from what I've been reading, is the fact that when you purchase your unit, your first year's subscription is included. So these things are affordable to begin with, and then when they throw in a full year subscription to join with that, it's to me it's a win-win deal as long as the device performs the way it should be. But yeah, definitely check that out. Looks like it's something that's going to be hitting the market, and it's going to be probably very well sought after. Let's see here. A few more things. We got to shout out our Buy Me a Coffee. We got Jay and Sherry from Beauty of the Backcountry. They keep me well caffeinated. Thanks very much. Let's take a dip. That's a hot coffee. And just to let everybody know, you know what? My house is smelling like a bakery. My wife's upstairs doing some Christmas cookie baking for her little cookie exchange that she's got coming up this weekend. And the house smells delicious. So my stomach's going to be rumbling throughout this whole episode, I think. Let's see here. Just going to get our channel members floating across the screen. You know what? These are the people that make it happen for us here at Canoe Hound Adventures. For anybody who might be interested in becoming a channel member, it costs about 13 cents a day at the lowest level. And you know what? It really helps support the channel. So if you're interested in, just hit the join button down below here and feel free to become a channel member. Just to let you know, we are going to be having a great Christmas giveaway this year, and you have to be a channel member to win. I reward those who help keep the show going. So for anybody that might want that opportunity, it's not a hook or a crook here. You just need to be a member to have an opportunity to win at this point. So we'll keep them going across the bottom. So thanks to everybody going across the bottom of the screen. Greatly appreciated. Let's see here. A couple more things. Birthday wishes and special announcements. A young lady I know is turning 39 years old again. Pamela Good from Super Good Camping, the podcast. Pamela, happy birthday to you. And then, you know what? Somebody that I'm sure probably at least 90% of our chat over there follows on a regular basis, John and Aaron over at Lost Lakes. Well, John and Aaron tied the knot this past week. Congratulations to them. Wish you both many, many years, love, happiness, and adventures, of course. So yeah, for anybody that might be familiar with them, you know what? Go on their Facebook page or something and drop them a couple of well wishes there for their wedding. It's good stuff. Let's see here. We've got, yeah, if you have an event or anything special coming up, make sure you drop me an email at canoehound@gmail.com. Once again, I say this every week. It's the magic email. Drop me an email, and I respond to all of them. And do you have any guests or topics that you'd like to see on the show? Help me out. Help me out. Drop me a line. Let me know what you'd like to see on the show, and we'll do our darndest to make it happen. Anyways, without further ado, I think it's time that we get in with tonight's topic and our guests. Yeah, and we are going to have a swag giveaway tonight, too. Remember that. Anyways, tonight we're joined by members of the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters and the Invading Species Awareness Program to learn more about the threat of invasive species and invasive plants or invading plants that threaten our Ontario lakes, rivers, and forests. Let's bring up on panel. We have Brook Schryer, we have Robert McGowan, and we have Jeff Berthelette. Did I say that right?
Yep, good enough.
All right, good enough. All right. Good evening, guys. How are you doing? Thanks very much for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having us, Dennis.
Thank you.
Cool. So, you know what? This is a topic that has been suggested to me on numerous occasions, and I finally had the opportunity to meet one of your representatives at a outdoor show recently, and we kind of had that connection that came across. And here we are, probably not even a month later, and the show's happening. So this is a good thing. I'm always out there looking and trying to learn more, obviously, about my surroundings when I'm in the backcountry. And to me, this is a very important topic because there are some things going on and going wrong back in the backcountry, right, when it comes to these invading species. What can you tell us a bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. So I'll start. So again, thank you, Dennis. My name is Brook Schryer. I'm the assistant coordinator with the Invading Species Awareness Program. And yeah, invasive species have been impacting Ontario and Canada for a very long time, dating back centuries. And the organization that I work for actually started the Invading Species Awareness Program in partnership with the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry back in 1992, because the province had recognized that the initial invasive species that really prompted the program, which was zebra mussels, had gotten into the province, and specifically Lake St. Clair, and they started to realize that people weren't really being educated about what invasive species were, nor were they being educated about how to prevent the spread of invasive species. So back in 1992, as I said, the Invading Species Awareness Program started as a partnership program, one of 4 conservation programs out of the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters. And we've been running ever since. And our program has definitely grown over the years. I think it started as 1 staff member or maybe 2 back in the day. And it was called the Zebra Mussel Hotline is what we delivered back in 1992 when I was, I guess, 2 years old. And, fast forward to today, we manage and we track and educate Ontario's public about a plethora of invasive species, hundreds of terrestrial invasive species, dozens, if not even more than that, aquatic invasive species. We deliver a number of programs related to invasive species management, such as the Mystery Snail program up in Haliburton, which Rob can speak to maybe a little bit later. We run a wild pig surveillance program in partnership with the MRF because wild pigs are becoming an increasing issue in the province. And we deliver things like the Invading Species Hotline, which I've alluded to, and things like the Early Detection and Distribution Mapping System, or EDMAPS, which is an online web page where people can report invasive species. So we have our toes in so many different areas of the invasive species world. And you mentioned it before, trade shows. That's also another big part of our program, where every year we travel to a number of different trade shows trying to spread that education and outreach.
Mm-hmm. So tell us a little bit about, I guess, so, okay, you're mentioning that the Ontario, there's so many words here. I got to try.
I know, sorry, it's a mouthful.
The Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters started the Invading Species Awareness Program.
Yeah. Okay. Back in 1992 as a partnership with the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. So our provincial government.
Okay. Yeah. So tell us about, first off, the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters.
Sure.
And then we'll segue into the Invasive Species Awareness Program.
Sure. So we're the largest not-for-profit fish and wildlife conservation organization in Ontario. We represent 100,000 members, subscribers, and supporters, including 725 membership clubs. And really, we advocate for hunting and angling. We are a science-based organization, and we represent the voice of anglers and hunters, as well as trappers. So, for example, when the MRF is implementing or proposing policy which potentially could impact angling, fishing, or hunting in some way, we are the ones that offer comments and make sure that the government is held accountable when it comes to fish and wildlife decision making. But we're also so much more than that. We have, I mentioned our conservation programs before. We have the Invading Species Awareness Program, which is who we work with, the 3 of us. But we also have a lot of other great programs as well. We also have the Alternative Land Use Services, or ALICE, which is a program that's dedicated to restoring farmland to its more natural state. We have the Community Hatchery Program, which works with hundreds of volunteers across the province to grow fish to then be stocked into our lakes, so that anglers can enjoy catching fish and enjoying fish. And then we also have the Atlantic salmon program, which is dedicated to restoring a reproducing population of Atlantic salmon. And I know that there's goals of trying to reestablish that population. I think the year was 2025, but I'm not sure if that's still in sight or if it's been pushed back a little bit. But the program is continuing to work with schools to grow Atlantic salmon fry so that we can then release those back into our waters. Because if people don't know, Atlantic salmon were actually extirpated from the Great Lakes a number of years ago. And now we're trying to reintroduce and reestablish that population.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So I see each one of you have a different position within the invading species program. What can you each explain what your roles are, and then maybe we'll start getting into some of these issues that we're having with backcountry, because a lot of our viewers are backcountry people. Like we're canoers, hikers, backpackers, paddlers, whatever it might be. And we really want to know, I think some of the dirty is what do we got to do to stop the spread, right? So what are your roles with the organization?
Guys, I've talked a lot, so why don't one of you jump in?
Okay, we'll take Jeff.
Yeah, makes sense. I'm the most recent addition to ISAP. So my name is Jeff Berthelette. I'm the outreach liaison with the Invading Species Awareness Program. I collaborate and build relationships and network with a number of different partner organizations, anything from partners at the MNRF to cottage and lake associations, spreading awareness, advocating, campaigning, providing resources. I also manage our water steward program, which is a volunteer-based initiative from funding through the Ontario Trillium Grow Grant Fund around the Durham, Pine Hill, and Halliburton and Kawartha Lakes area. Got a roster of over 100 volunteers in the area, and we're all out there at launches trying to spread awareness on preventing aquatic invasive species, how to clean, drain, dry your boat and watercraft as you take it in and out of the water. And I also, one of the best parts of my job is manning the hotline, where I think the last numbers that we're at is 140. Brook, help me out. How many calls have we had so far this year?
Oh, this year? Oh, I think you're thinking like 1,100. And so we usually get it's usually over 1,000 phone calls a year. At the peak of COVID, I'd say 2020 was actually the busiest year. And I think it's because everybody was like stuck at home. So people were going out into their gardens, like you were showing Dennis, the English ivy before we started, and people were doing that and then going, oh man, I've got an invasive species in my garden. I'm going to call it in. I've been meaning to do this. So we had about 1,500 calls that year, which I know that it may not sound like a lot when you hear that number, but then you need to consider that we're a team of 6 and those numbers are compressed because that's not
normal work week of 5.
It's not, it's not 1,500 calls over 12 months. That's like 1,500 calls kind of compacted into like 4 to 6 months if we're lucky. So it's a lot of phone calls, and full props to Rob and Jeff who assist with manning the invading species hotline and really trying to provide Ontario's public with as much information or assistance in tracking these invasive species.
There you go. And how about yourself, Rob? What's your role?
So I am the ISAP project specialist. So I deal with a lot of the on-the-ground projects, such as the Mystery Snail Removal Program and the Water Soldier Surveillance Program. So the Mystery Snail Removal Program has been running since 2021, and basically it's a collaboration between the Coalition of Halliburton Property Owners Association and their role in the program is they're our volunteers. Those are the people that are on the ground wanting to remove these invasive snails from their lakes to make their lake healthier. And then there's other partners are the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks, who is our funder. So they funded the project for the past 3 years. And then we Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry works with us to get the scientific collector's permit for fishes, because these snails are considered fishes under the Federal Fisheries Act. And together we coordinate removal efforts for these landowners to go out and remove these snails who, they foul up their shoreline, they impede recreational activities. So we just want to get them out and they prevent them from causing any more harm and displacing our native snails and mussels.
Yeah,
And
and
then-
Dennis, sorry to interrupt. Can you pull up the slide there?
Certainly.
Yeah, so this
Yep.
is just a quick little snapshot of the program from 2023, as Rob was talking about. And Rob mentioned some of these numbers here, but just to give people a better understanding of the program and the scale of the program. It's incredible to think that in 3 years, our volunteers, who are not getting paid, who are doing this purely out of the kindness of their, of their hearts, have gone out and removed almost 1 million mystery snails. And you can see in the photos there, like these aren't really small per se. Like these are, especially the Chinese mystery snail, it's a larger specimen, can get up to about 6-7 centimeters from bottom to top. So these are big snails, and are bottom feeders, and as Rob said, foul people's shorelines, and are a pretty nasty customer. But we have a great crew up in that area of volunteers who go out throughout the summer to pull these things and then report all of their data back to us. So, it's been a really successful program, and just 3 years, they've removed almost 1 million. So next year, as long as we pull at least 70,000, we will bridge the 1 million mark, which is
We were looking for 1 million this year, but for sure next year.
yeah.
And that's unbelievable. So your volunteers are going out there and they're quite literally plucking these off the shorelines of the lake.
Yep. And they're trained. They're trained as well. I know, Rob, I think you mentioned that, but because the main concern for us is protecting native species, right? Like we don't want individuals out there just haphazardly pulling things out of the water. We want to make sure this is done right. We make sure that they get trained. We make sure that they're able to understand the differences, the physical differences between these invasive snails and our native snails. And I think in the 3 years that we've done it, we've actually only had one circumstance of one native snail being euthanized, which was unfortunate, but that's pretty good. Of course, there may be more that we just don't know about, but we've done everything we can to ensure that the process is as kind to native species as possible while removing these invasive species from our waters.
Right. Now, I want to pull something up here and put it on screen from your website. I actually I've spent a lot of time on your website here over the past few days just trying to become more familiar with this. And it's rather interesting here, as I was pointing out in the green room, that under the topic of invaders, you have a bunch of different categories. As you mentioned earlier, Brook, right? The terrestrial, the aquatic, fisheries, invertebrates, forests and pests, wildlife. I thought it'd be maybe a good opportunity for us to maybe take a few steps through a few of these to say, I know they're all big risks, but maybe what some of the bigger risks are according to each category. And then we'll get into what we as, backcountry people, what we can actually do to help, right?
Sure.
Or to help not spread these different things. So can we start with maybe terrestrial plants?
Sure, and just I'll probably defer to Jeff on that one, but real quick before that, Cool Quest had asked, "Are they good to eat?" He said, "Question: Are they good to eat?" And ironically, well, I guess it's not ironic. I think I was the crazy person who tried them. I captured some of the Chinese mystery snails because this is a species that was actually intentionally introduced to San Francisco back in the late 1880s as a food item. Like Chinese mystery snails were brought here for food. And the year that they were noticed in the food market, it was the very next year that they were introduced to San Francisco Harbor. And then over the next, 150 years have been spreading throughout North America and have found their way into our waters. And I was the crazy person who took some home and put them in water and purged them as people do with like crayfish, right? You kind of try to clean them out. And then I tried boiling some with some spices. And man, I don't have a palate for it. It wasn't good. And so I wouldn't really recommend it. And despite the fact of them being in water for about 48 hours, they were still gritty and just not good. So they still had a lot of sediment within them and in their meat. So just not recommended to eat them. And nor are zebra mussels edible as well, as I saw another question about whether or not zebra mussels are edible.
Garlic butter, Brook.
Sorry, say that again.
You need more garlic butter.
Yeah. I guess enough garlic butter can make anything taste good, but I don't know. It was the consistency of the Chinese. It was hard to get past like the guts to couldn't do it. But going back to your question, Dennis, I think Jeff, maybe if you want to take the lead on some of the terrestrial stuff, terrestrial plants specifically.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, like I was mentioning in the green room there, Dennis, there's a staggering amount of invasive plants that a lot of people don't really realize. Most people, if they just look outside in their garden, at their yards, most of the yards in Ontario are made of Kentucky bluegrass. That's an invasive plant. You know, everyone has a nice, pretty common lilac tree in their garden. That's an invasive plant. You go down towards Kingston, around the Frontenac area, and these really pristine, unique wetland habitats called alvars, they're just riddled with lilacs, and they're incredibly invasive in that area. So the context behind invasive species is twofold. Number one is that they're not native to the area that they're introduced, but also that they have to have a negative impact on that ecosystem, on that economy, on the public health of the area. So, you know, a lot of plants that are, you know, just annuals, right? You plant it in your garden, it dies, that's the end of it. Not necessarily an invasive plant. But, you know, you walk out into the trails and you're looking around, you're seeing buckthorn, you're seeing dog strangling vine, you're seeing Phragmites. You know, these invasive plants make up about, I don't know, 90-95% of the calls that we get on our hotline. And, you know, the thing that I tell people is they're really, really, really good at what they do, right? They're incredibly aggressive species. And, you know, there's really only one thing. The best silver bullet to manage invasive plant is to prevent their spread in the first place. And that goes the same, that's the same with every invasive species. Is once you have the species introduced into an area, it is incredibly difficult to remove. So, you know, when you're getting out in the trail, I know it's absolutely the last thing people want to do. Give your ATV, your quad, your snowshoes, whatever, your hiking boots, give it a rub down, a wash, remove any of the mud before you get out on the trail. That way, if there's any seeds of, as I said, like dog strangling vine is a really popular one, any of those seeds are not transmitted into new areas.
Yeah. And just another one to mention that I saw, I think Evan, sorry, LE5, ask about or mention earlier, because he's from the Ottawa area, is wild parsnip. And so those are also some pretty nasty customers. When I talk about, you know, invasive plants, I'm a little bit biased towards those ones only insofar as that they're actually phototoxic. So wild parsnip, giant hogweed, those are two invasive plants that we have in Ontario and are quite widespread in some areas. As Evan was mentioning, wild parsnip is very prevalent within the Ottawa region. And as I said, you know, if you come in contact with this plant and you get, you know, the sap onto your skin, it reacts with the sunlight, phototoxic, and it'll cause some insane dermatitis, blistering. And so, you know, Jeff had mentioned the characteristics that make up an invasive species, one of them being a threat to human health. And wild parsnip and giant hogweed check those boxes. They are a threat to human health. And I wouldn't encourage people to do this, but if you Google, you know, giant hogweed burns or wild parsnip burns, you'll see what I'm talking about. It's a very serious customer, and that sap, what I've read at least, is that it can stay dormant on your skin for up to 10 years. So it can reactivate after time. So if you get it on yourself, and, you know, my recommendation is always hot shower, you know, Dawn, dish soap, like clean yourself the best you can. But it just shows you that, you know, there's a lot of invasive species in the province, and there are a number of invasive species that, you know, unbeknownst to many people, are actually a threat to their human health, not to mention a threat to the environment and the economy, as Jeff had said.
So if anything, through learning this, because I was not aware that, you know, anybody who might be in the area, and if they think it's there, it's a good time to figure out how to identify these things. You know, like I learned after experiencing poison ivy exactly what poison ivy is. You know what I mean? I can pick it out just through the corner of my eye, and I'm always warning my friends because, like, I really react bad to it now.
Yeah.
But you learn how to identify something really quick when you can realize the dangers of it.
Exactly. And giant hogweed, I don't know if you've ever seen it, is a massive plant. Like it's it's so obvious when you see it because it's so massive. I think it's predominantly more of a threat when it's just a ground cover because it doesn't flower every year. And when it's a ground cover, its leaves are very aggressive looking, but the leaves are also contain that same sap that can cause that, phototoxic reaction on your skin. But yeah, so they're, these plants can get upwards of like 10 feet tall, and their umbels, like their flower heads, can be like a meter wide. So they're very obvious when you see them, but it's kind of crazy because these are actually brought in as an ornamental plant, right? People thought they were pretty. And the one and only time I've ever encountered giant hogweed in the wild, I was a second person to the scene, and the woman who was there prior to me was actually touching the plant. So she had no idea what it was. She thought it was pretty. I bet you she thought that she was gonna steal some seeds or something and take them back home. And when I got there, I told her it's a very dangerous plant. I hope you haven't touched it. And she said, "Oh, I have been touching it." So, of course, well, go home. Take a shower, wash yourself off. But it just shows you, right? Like she had no idea. And she thought it was
funny part of it too, like just looking at this picture, and I scroll down here to this here that tells you like giant hogweed is invasive, wild parsnip, but Queen Anne's lace is non-native, but they all have a similar appearance, right?
Definitely. And that is one of the biggest challenges in the invasive species world is the fact that there are so many lookalike species, right? Mm-hmm. When it comes to fishes, there are so many lookalike species for things like the Asian carps. When you talk about plants, there are so many lookalike species. I know these guys can probably attest to it, but when I've been answering the invading species hotline for 8 years since I started in the program, and I've had Queen Anne's lace reported a number of times as giant hogweed. And my question always becomes, well, how thick is the stem? Because the stem on Queen Anne's lace is about this big, whereas giant hogweed is about this big. So, you can usually get to the bottom of it pretty quickly, but people sometimes just don't have that information, and a quick Google search will lead them to believe that they have something that they don't necessarily have. And that's why education is so important.
Right. And I had to ask you earlier in the green room because one of my dog route walks, I come across this English ivy, and it stuff is like blanketed. It's covered all over the place. And I asked you, like, what do you do? Do I call it in and you send in the troops and they'll come down with hose and shovels and everything to dig this stuff out? And that's not the case in most cases, right?
No. And, it's unfortunate because I wish that was the case. Imagine how cool that would be. But, it's like, I always kind of referenced like your house getting termites, right? When, like, let's say under the circumstance your house gets termites, what do? You call somebody, a professional, to come in, and you have to pay for it. And unfortunately, the reality in Ontario today is if there is an invasive plant that is found and it's on your property, it is your responsibility to deal with it. And I know that stinks, but hey, like I've got 50 common horns in my backyard, and I wish somebody would come take them out, but it's my responsibility. It's my responsibility as a landowner. Now, that being said, people might ask the questions around, like, well, what about municipal property? And, well, it's the municipality's, responsibility. However, depending on the species, they may not even want to deal with it. If you call in something like English ivy and it's on municipal property, they're probably not going to prioritize that because they're going to use their money that they have to prioritize species such as wild parsnip, such as giant hogweed, the ones that are a threat to their constituency, right? To the people in their area. They're not going to worry about English ivy because they simply don't have the resources. So going back to what I was saying before, it would be amazing if we had these task forces that could go out and deal with every single report, but that's simply not the case. Now, we are fortunate, however, in Ontario to have a great partnership of organizations that work collectively towards what's called early detection and rapid response. So exactly what you were mentioning, right? But it's used very selectively, and it's typically used for a very high profile species that we don't want either A, expanding its distribution in the province, or B, showing up at all, right? Mm-hmm. And like this year alone, we had a number of species show up for the first time. And that early detection rapid response has been done by different agencies. We had a crayfish show up. Well, I guess I should say last year. But when it showed up, we responded, the ministry responded, the city of Burlington responded, and it's been in the news. It's called the marbled crayfish. And it shows you how a number of organizations can come together very quickly. And trust me, we've been doing it since it was found, not just now, because rapid response, we need to, make sure we do that word, which is rapid, to have the highest degree of success. We all collectively work together to try to respond to that. You probably also heard in the news that oak wilt showed up in the province. We were the ones that received that phone call. Jeff was the one who spoke with the arborist, who then, Jeff took that information, got that to the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, CFIA, our federal government, and they sent in bios to go then confirm what was the first report of oak wilt in the province. So then they quarantined that area. They rapidly responded to that detection that came early, right? So that's the ideal way to deal with invasive species. But unfortunately, that's not always the way, because, I was going to leave this thunder for Jeff, but he hasn't mentioned it yet, only because I've been doing all the talking, unfortunately. There are a lot of invasive species in the province. There are 445. Jeff, you said upwards of 700, but I would contest that. It all depends on who you ask. And how you define invasive species, which is a whole nother can of worms. But there are about 445 invasive terrestrial plants today in Ontario. And that's a huge number. So the question that I would pose is, how do you prioritize 445 different species? Because anytime you look at one species and the management of said species in a vacuum, like we can talk about water soldier and the costs associated of monitoring and trying to eradicate one species and how much that is and how restrictive that is. And then you try to extrapolate that to 445, just terrestrial plants. The number would become trillions of dollars. That's how much it would cost us to manage and try to eradicate all these species. And at the end of the day, it wouldn't even be successful. And the reason being is because many of these species are so ingrained and would be so impossible to eradicate that it's simply not worth it, right? So things like, unfortunately, I hate to say this, Eurasian water milfoil, which is an invasive aquatic plant, is just so widespread throughout the province. Because it's a submergent aquatic plant, you just simply can't eradicate that. So our messaging will fall back on, do what you can as a landowner and manage your own shoreline, and try to remain positive in managing your little slice of paradise, without trying to achieve the goal of eradicating it from an entire lake, because it's just simply not realistic. And when expectations are so high, they will 99.9% of the time fall short. So one of the things we do as a program is manage expectations when it comes to invasive species, and while also, primarily as a program, trying to focus on species that aren't here yet, right? That's really where we spend a lot of our time, because that's where we can make a huge difference. Because if you can stop something like an Asian carp, and I'm sorry, I'm jumping all over the place here, but I think it's important to hear this stuff. To be able to stop something like an Asian carp would save our economy. The federal government did a risk assessment on this, would save us like $50 billion. That's how much they would cost us, by the way, if they became established in the Great Lakes. If the grass carp, one of the 4 species of Asian carps, became established in the Great Lakes, it will cost us $50 billion to the economy by 2050. So invest in prevention, right? And education and outreach is so vitally important. As Jeff
with that being said, though, yeah. I was reading a couple of reports, either on the website or somewhere in your socials, that you have found instances in Fort Erie of an Asian carp. And another one on Lake.
There was 3 this year. There was 3. Again,
they are getting here. That's the scary part.
Yeah, they are. And there's a whole can of worms, Dennis, there. I don't know if you want to open it. But so there are 4 species of Asian carps, right? And I do want to give Rob a chance to talk about some water soldiers. So before we jump into Asian carps, can we just come back to water soldier? Because I've alluded to it. Sure. Rob's talked about it. And I really want to show some of those slides that Rob has here, because I think this is really important for context when you're talking about the success of trying to eradicate and how much the cost is for one plant, okay? So I'm going to let Rob kind of talk through this. Rob, Dennis, if you don't mind bringing those slides up, I'll kind of work through the slides as you talk about it.
Yeah. So water soldier, perennial aquatic plant, first discovered in the Trent Severn Waterway in 2008. And that was the first report in North America of this aquatic plant back then. Since then, it's spread. There's been active management since 2013. So basically, there's a water soldier working group, which is made up of the provincial government, the federal government, NGOs, academia, conservation authorities, that we work collaboratively together to address water soldier. And these pictures that Brook are showing right now is just a progression of, and demonstrating why we don't want these plants coming into our waterways, because in a short 2 years here, you can see how much this plant has spread in these dense colonies. Sorry?
Yeah, so there's 2013, and then you see the advancement to 2014.
You can see how it's kind of coming out into the littoral zone and going out into the bay. And then if we get to the next slide, this is the August 2015. These just are really powerful pictures on how prevention of these plants establishing is paramount, right? So this guy's in his boat. He's thinking he's going out somewhere, but he's probably not, or he's going to have to expend a lot of energy doing so. So this is one way. It's impeding his recreation. I know this couple, this lady and this gentleman. We work closely with them. They were very upset that they couldn't get, because they own an island on this lake and they couldn't get there. So if we help get the message out there about preventing the spread and establishment of these plants, it's much more easier to manage them. So after management, we were very successful with this population, actually. So next year, 2016, you can still see some plants in the foreground there. Advancing the slide to 2017. Is that not all gone? There's some plants there that are lingering around. But in 2018,
that's you, Rob.
Pardon?
Is that you?
That's me in the boat. It is.
Gotta give you props.
Yeah. So 2018, we had that bay we had water soldier eradicated from that bay. Unfortunately, Trent Severn Waterway is a flowing system. Water soldier is a floating plant. So water soldier has spread downstream and into the Bay of Quinte. We're still working on eradicating it, but the scope of the project has gotten much larger. In terms of cost to manage the species, hundreds and hundreds of $1,000s a year for management, not the collaboration of all of the great partners that are on the working group. That's just the management. So,
Rob, if you had to guess how much has been spent since 2008 to try to manage, monitor, and eradicate water soldier from the Trent Severn Waterway, what would be your educated guess? 10 million?
10, 20 million? Possibly.
Wow.
Like you're talking in the tens of millions of dollars when you account for the staff time of all the different organizations, the travel, the time spent on water, the product that has been used, contracting companies to come in and apply a herbicide. It's just huge. It's huge.
So
gives you context.
Really hit home about putting things in context of like, let's stop these species from arriving and establishing in the first place, and we won't have to have this overbearing cost of managing them. Yeah.
And so I think it's really important to give some context around, you mentioned that it's, it's a biannual, is it a plant? Is that correct? Or perennial, sorry? It is an annual. Okay. But this plant
it's a perennial.
It is a perennial. Yeah, it's a perennial that was sold in the garden trade for years.
Nurseries used to sell them and give them away when you bought fish because they grow exponentially.
Right. See, Nancy W is asking that. Do garden centers sell invasive species like ivy? And it's quite obviously they must.
Yes, they do.
But it's not regulated.
No. So let's go back to the regulations in Ontario. So the Invasive Species Act was brought into enforcement in 2015, and received royal assent in 2016. So came into law. And at that point, the provincial government I shouldn't say only, but they prohibited and restricted a small-ish number of species, probably in like the 12 to 15 range, and water soldier was one of them. So water soldier back in 2016 became prohibited, meaning that it could not be bought, sold, traded, given away, propagated, any word you want to use, basically. You couldn't do it. But unfortunately, pre-2016, it was perfectly legal for garden centers to sell this plant. And they had done so, as Rob mentioned, in droves. And people would introduce this to their back garden ponds. And what would happen is, you guys saw the image, their ponds would turn into what looked like a lawn. And they're like, I don't know what to do with this. So they would start pulling it. And unfortunately, every now and again, you get an individual who doesn't really think about the repercussions of potentially introducing something like this to our natural waterways. And that same statement is true about any group of species. You were asking about terrestrial species before and all the different groupings that we have. Almost all of those have been introduced by humans, whether intentionally or unintentionally. That is kind of the definition of an invasive species. And in some circumstances, they may not understand the repercussions. And because they don't, they think they're doing, maybe a good, like letting go their goldfish because they don't want to kill them. And then all of a sudden you have a pond full of goldfish. Or in this case, you have the TSW with water soldier. And then, groups like ours working tirelessly for like decades trying to eradicate it. So that's why education and outreach, again, is so vitally important, is to teach people not to introduce things to our waters, regardless of whether you think it's benign or not.
Sure. So Untamed Ontario's asking, are there any other species after humans that could be held responsible for spreading invasive species across habitats? I'm sure it could be. Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Go ahead, guys.
Yeah. Jeff, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, number one, the science is unclear if invasive species are transmitted through waterfowl, or I'm sure seeds cling to deer spur and stuff, and that transmits the invasive plant from one area to the next. Here's the thing, we can't control what those animals or how the natural spread of invasive species occur. Mm-hmm. We can control how we introduce them and how we spread them, and that's where we prioritize our focus.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right? Like there are a variety of ways that invasive species spread, even beyond humans. There's natural spread, as Jeff was just alluding to, and natural spread can be things like rhizomes, like the roots of Phragmites that grow 30 meters and develop a new plant, and then that plant develops rhizomes, and it continues to spread that way, right? And he also mentioned waterfowl, geese, those types of animals. There have been some studies done, and I have heard of individuals, some individuals, particularly in the States, allude to definitive movement of species such as like New Zealand mud snails, things like that, via waterfowl. So there's natural expansion, there's human expansion of invasive species, which is again the most common way that these things are spread. But of course, yeah, there's always those unforeseens, right? We were talking about the other day about jet streams and how invasive insects can get into the jet stream and then go whoop, so there's all sorts of ways that we cannot control. But as Jeff said, there are many ways that we can control, and as the science has shown, the things that we can control are the ones that are kind of leading the way or are causing the most introductions of invasive species. And it's about 9 times out of 10 when we as a program, because we track invasive species in Ontario, that's what one of our jobs via EdMaps is, when somebody reports something to us that is far outside of its known distribution. And what I mean by that is, round gobies, we know that they're in Lake Simcoe. We know that they're in Rice Lake. We know that they're in the Great Lakes. But all of a sudden, when you have a new one show up that's far away, we were talking about European water chestnut before and how it showed up in the Welland. We can always sit there and go, that got here because of this. And we don't know for a fact, not unless we catch the person or, actually see it being introduced, but we know. with pretty great certainty how X, Y, or Z species is introduced, and 99% of the time it's by humans.
Right. This is an interesting question here. Is success in invasive species management considered in terms of elimination or control?
Oh no!
Right.
Questions around success, guys. We didn't have this on our list of potential questions. That's a tough one.
Never know what to expect here on Canoe Hounds Outdoor Adventure Show.
Well, I think that everybody could answer that differently. Elimination, I would feel more successful than control. Although control, we've had success. Obviously, you set out a goal, and as you know, my goal is to eradicate or be part of the team that eradicates water soldier. I don't feel like I'm successful unless I do. It drives me. It keeps me going. But we've had success with control, and you have to celebrate that as well, I think. Or else you're just going to be down in the dumps. It's a daunting task. You're fighting nature. It's a tough one. So we take our wins where we can, and we keep our head down and keep moving forward with a positive attitude.
But the thing about success is, with invasive species, you could do an amazing job and be successful, but never even know it, right?
Yeah.
Because success is preventing something from getting here in the first place.
Yeah.
So if we don't have a species, which we have advocated for, spread education and outreach about, people might say to us, well, why are we even talking about that? We don't have it. And it may be because that one person was educated and didn't release it into the water, or that one person didn't bring it into Ontario as bait because they had been educated about it. So we have no way of measuring that, right? Beyond it just not being here. But when something is here, the terminology around success is just, it's so subjective, right? Because again, you have to weigh that in contrast to the amount of resources that are spent on it. There's kind of a cliche saying in the invasive species world where it's like an ounce of prevention is worth a huge amount, right? Because of how much it's going to cost you in the long run if you don't invest in education, outreach, and prevention. So if you put $10 into prevention, you may only spend $10, but if you don't, you may end up spending $1 million in the long run, and that's widely accepted in the invasive species world. So prevention, education, outreach, again, are so vitally important. And I alluded to it before, and I'll say it again. There are so many groups in Ontario and Canada-wide that are working on invasive species, and it'd be remiss not to give them props. Like we out of the UFAH are one of those organizations, but you have the Invasive Species Center out of Sault Ste. Marie who do very similar work nationally. You have the ministry who have the Invasive Species Act, who work with us, who fund programs like our own. You have the Department of Fisheries and Oceans who work on Asian carps. You have CFIA who work on oak wilts and spotted lanternfly and all sorts of other things.
OIPC, FOCA.
Yeah, you have the Ontario Invasive Plant Council, another NGO who works on terrestrial plants. You have FOCA, the Federation of Ontario Cottagers Association, all sorts of names that I can throw out there of great groups.
We're all fighting the same fight.
Yeah. And we're all working collaboratively as well. We work together on many of these programs because we don't want to recreate the wheel and we don't want to waste money. So in the invasive species world, we realize that resources are finite. So we do our best to collaborate with all those different organizations to ensure that, hey, if you have a good idea, run with it. And then when you create that resource, we're going to take that print ready file and we're going to print it ourselves and start giving it away as well. Because there's no ownership when it comes to education and outreach. We want to make sure that we are collaborating with all the different groups in Ontario to get this messaging out there.
Yeah, that makes sense. You also mentioned, and something I kind of got out of a few of these little conversations was a lot of the invasive species are contained to areas, right? And so eventually they're going to keep growing. But I guess the whole idea is to keep that containment and then try and work it in, right? Try and
that would be ideal. And going back to success, that would be a case of success, right?
Right.
And so if somebody, like we were alluding to before, like we talked about before, if somebody were to contact us and say, hey, I have a population of X species on my property, what do I do? we would walk them through some of the techniques that they can implement to try to eradicate that. First things first, manage expectations. Number two is try to develop a plan with them that will work for them and their lifestyle, but also making sure that they understand that this is not something that's going to be done overnight. Not unless they, maybe hire somebody to come in and spray with like a herbicide, let's say. But even then, that's usually not a silver bullet, right? It's not a silver bullet, as we have found out. So what we talk about is a pest management plan, integrated pest management plan, which incorporates all these different techniques to try to manage something. So to use this example, let's say something like English ivy. We would talk about managing peripheral populations, like you mentioned, Dennis, so that you work towards the center. You don't want to start at the center because then it's just going to keep spreading. So these are, and you'd think this is common sense, but it's not always. So you work around the edges, you bring it back. You do things like tarping. You do things like maybe a herbicide application, maybe. You do things like, pulling, hand pulling, solarizing those plants so that they cannot regrow, those types of things. So it's always incorporating multiple techniques to try to eradicate a species that you're dealing with.
Right. Very.
Yeah. And if I can, sorry,
we got a lot of great questions popping up in the chat that I want to pull up, and hopefully we get on to some of the other invasive species like, animal life and stuff like that. And of course, what we can do as backcountry campers, hikers, whatever it might be to help not spread, right? But we'll get on with that. Jeffrey, you were about to say something? Sorry.
Oh, I saw a comment from Richard West, and he was asking about can invasive species be controlled by introducing another invasive species? And Untamed Ontario said, see Australia for cautionary tales with the frog emoji. That's cane toads that are wreaking absolute havoc in Australia. So to answer that question, the CFIA has a pretty stringent process that they undertake to assess whether other species can be introduced to help combat invasive species. So it's not unheard of, but it's not taken lightly by any stretch.
Right. Yeah. And we're not the only country that's dealing with all these issues, obviously, right?
Oh, no. And I saw somebody mention having, we're fishing for walleye and only caught smallmouth bass. And I had alluded to like the definition of invasive species, and I know you're going to be wanting to take a break here, so I won't get into it too much. But when you talk about invasive species, the interesting thing is that it's different from every jurisdiction to jurisdiction, right? What's invasive in Ontario is not necessarily invasive in Ohio or Florida or Mexico or other parts of the world. So it is very dependent upon the geography, but it's also dependent on how you put values in your society. Like, what are the values of your society, right? And in our case, as we define them, as Jeff had defined them before, is species that have negative consequences on our economy, on our society, and on our environments. So it's a sliding scale, and it's not always clear. And some people would argue that there are many different things that are invasive species that we don't necessarily think about or talk about. But then there's many people who would say the things that we talk about aren't invasive species. So again, like it's very subjective. And I think it's really important that people consider that when talking about the subject, because something like a smallmouth bass can be considered invasive depending on where it's introduced, right? So this all just goes back to the same point that we've been trying to make all night, is don't introduce things where they don't belong.
Yeah. And along that lines, like, if you introduce smallmouth bass into a lake that's not a bass lake, you're creating an invasive species for that particular region or that lake, right?
Yeah,
okay,
exactly.
Cool. We're going to take a quick commercial break here, and then we'll return, and we're going to find out a little bit more about like aquatic life, plant or animal life, and things like that we might not be aware of, and things, some best practices that we could do to help prevent this stuff. So we'll see you in a few short minutes here.
There's nothing like being out there. For over 50 years, we've been connecting people with nature by building classic Canadian canoe designs using the best materials available. We built a reputation on durable, dependable canoes that allow you to focus on what's important, whether that's unplugging in remote wilderness, spending quality time with your favorite people, or nailing the perfect line. Visit novacraft.com to find the perfect canoe for you and locate your nearest authorized dealer.
Tonight's episode of CANOEHOUND'S Outdoor Adventure Show is brought to you by Kid Products, stick stoves and reflector ovens proudly made in Canada. Algonquin Outfitters, with 5 key locations in and around Algonquin Park to serve your backcountry needs. Salis Marine, keeping you safe on the water since 1999. Ostrom Outdoors, custom fit canoe packs and barrel harnesses. And Novacraft Canoes, connecting you with nature in Canadian-made canoes since 1970.
And welcome back to the second half of CANOEHOUND'S Outdoor Adventure Show. We're having a great time. Well, a great time and learning a lot here about invasive species. Spent a lot on plant life here, and hopefully we can get into a lot more of the aquatic life and stuff like that. That might have to do with what are we doing in the backcountry to prevent any of these invasive species from getting up there. But really quick, before we do that, we do have a giveaway that we're going to run tonight there. I'm going to bring Jeff up on screen here because I believe he has one of the prize offerings. Welcome back, Jeff. What do you have to give away tonight?
We have one of our ISAP branded ball caps here, stepbacks. This one, you won't get something like this that's kind of weathered from months of field work. You're going to have a brand new one, but nice and snug and fashionable, good quality. You're also going to get a number of resources, educational guides, pamphlets, quick reference guides, all kinds of stuff to help educate you on invasive species.
Cool. Very good. And I will also throw in a Canoe Hound Adventures prize pack. We'll get that out to the lucky winner too. We'll take one winner. Please don't put the answer in the chat there. You have until Saturday evening to get your answer across to us at coasprize@gmail.com. That's floating across the bottom of the screen there. And I'll leave that up there for a minute or two. But tonight's question is, what year was the Invading Species Awareness Program founded and by who? If you get the answer wrong, I'll give you a chance to fix it up. But just drop me an email at coasprize@gmail.com. And you have until, I believe, Saturday night, I got on the screen Saturday evening, and I'll notify the winner on Sunday or Monday. We'll get all your contact information and have your prize shipped out to you. So thanks very much for that prize there, Jeff, and to the other fellas. And we'll just bring the other fellas back up now here on screen. And I'll try and get you all into the same order that we had you before, so we're not confusing things. But welcome back, gentlemen. Thanks very much for sharing all this information that you're sharing with us tonight. I'd like to get on to some of the aquatic stuff and some of the there's so many. It's such a widespread problem, right? That it covers so many categories, and we can quite literally have probably an episode on each of the topics themselves, right? Or even on each invasive species as it goes. What are some of the biggest problems right now? Like I'm going to throw a couple things off the top of my head that I and probably most people are aware of: zebra mussels, gobies, emerald ash borer beetles, purple loosestrife. These are some of the ones that are the ones that you probably hear most about in the mainstream. Where are we with a lot of these different ones that have basically created devastation across their ecosystems, right?
Go ahead, Rob.
So I was just going to say, once a species establishes itself, it's very difficult to get rid of it or eradicate it. And this is where it comes in, our messaging of preventing the spread. So in January 2022, the ministry came out with an amendment to the Invasive Species Act where they added in the clean and drain all of your boat, which includes kayaks, canoes, and all of your equipment that are carriers of these species to prevent that spread. So now these are chargeable offenses if you don't take these actions. So when you remove your boat from the water, you must remove all debris, mud, plants, drain all of your bilges, all of your ballasts, and unplug your plug from your boat to make sure that you're not transporting any of these species around. And that's one of the key messages that I think we're delivering to prevent the spread of invasive species. Because, a lot of these species that you're speaking about and we're speaking about are great around the Great Lakes. We have a vast province. The gateway to the north we talk about, North Bay. A lot of these species are just, they're really not present above that invisible line. So protecting the north is one of our key kind of messaging. We don't want these species to get into our pristine, outdoor habitats that we all love to enjoy and get away from the city. It's unfortunate that once a species comes in, it's very difficult to eradicate or get rid of. But this is the way it is.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And Dennis, getting to answer your question, I think some of those species that you mentioned are still having those impacts. I think some of those impacts are becoming not less realized, but maybe they've tapered off to an extent, and you can kind of attribute that to these species potentially reaching their carrying capacity, and then their populations reducing over time. And a key example there is zebra mussels. When zebra mussels were first introduced, as we mentioned before, they exploded. Their populations exploded. I grew up on Lake Scugog in the Kawarthas, and I remember the first introduction and how devastating it was to the lake, as as an ecosystem goes, but then also as a recreationist, like how bad it was for us. So those things are still having those same impacts. And I saw somebody comment on zebra mussels wreaking havoc. Yeah. Cool Quest again. I'm sorry if I'm saying that name wrong. Said that they're having severe impacts on shipwrecks within the Great Lakes, and that's an example of a species that is still having negative impacts, particularly in areas where it's being introduced. So you guys all saw at my family cottage on Crystal Lake, where that was a lake that 5 years ago didn't have zebra mussels, and now it does. And native clams completely covered in zebra mussels. So these things have not gone away. These are still issues that we're dealing with 31 years later. So we have to continue to educate Ontario's public about these things. And that is why that messaging that Rob was talking about, the clean, drain, dry, and the new regulations to ensure that people are cleaning and draining, because many people probably don't know that is now the law. You have to clean and drain your vessel when you're coming off the water, and you have to make sure that your plug is pulled on your vessel to facilitate that. Like, those are things that now are chargeable offenses. If a conservation officer sees you with your plug in your boat and you're transporting it, you have weeds on your boat, they can charge you. They may want to educate you first of all and maybe let you off with a warning, or they might give you a ticket. So that's something to keep in mind, because it's very important that we continue to spread that messaging around clean, drain, dry, particularly for species like zebra mussels. Now, getting into some of those other big ones that you talked about, purple loosestrife, like before my time, back in like the 80s, I think they were like dubbed like the killer of wetlands. And nowadays, and I saw somebody comment about the release of the beetle to control purple loosestrife. And I think that's one of, maybe depending on how you define it, one of those success stories, again, going back to the subjectivity of success, that we've seen in the province, wherein, that was a somewhat effective biocontrol that was used to manage purple loosestrife. And another species I have on my property, but seemingly never really a problem. And I noticed that bees like them. So, it's, again, going back to the subjectivity around these invasive species, but I just don't think purple loosestrife ever lived up to what it was being kind of warned to be, or warned that it would become back in those times. In my mind, Phragmites is like, by and large, 1,000,000 times worse than purple loosestrife. Phragmites is probably the worst invasive species. And I think, who was it again? There was a government entity, Environment Canada, said that, I think it was Environment Canada that said that Phragmites is the worst invasive species in Ontario and Canada. Like, this thing is widespread. It's on every single.
I'm pretty sure it was the IUCN, the International Union on the Conservation of Nature, that said Phragmites is the #1 worst invasive species in the world.
There you go. Yeah. And this
I'm looking for that on the website. What is Phragmites? Is that an animal? Sorry.
No, it's an invasive reed. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. It's called European common reed or Phragmites. Sorry, I was using its other common name. but yeah, it's called European Common Reed, and it's all throughout Southern Ontario. If you've driven along the 401 or any of the 400 series highways in Southern Ontario, Phragmites is all along it. It's just absolutely atrocious invasive species.
It's definitely moving northward, and I can appreciate a lot of the talk about, you know, that barrier into Northern Ontario, because I'm actually from North Bay, you know, and I know Rob has spent a lot of time working in Northern Ontario as well. So protecting those northern lakes that, even I know, Dennis, a lot of your listeners love, you know, portaging, kayaking, canoeing, those northern lakes. We got to protect them, right? Because a lot of those lakes are untouched from invasive species. You know, Lake Nipissing unfortunately has spiny water flea, which, you know, they say it's the next big risk to Northern Ontario lakes right after acid rain from the smelt operation in Sudbury. So it's every single species has its own risks and its own effects to those prospective ecosystems, but the underlying silver bullet to protect everything is just do your due diligence, clean your boat, clean your kayak, clean your watercraft before you move it across land. The unfortunate reality is, though, we should have been doing this about 30 or 40 years ago.
Yeah.
Right. And then, like, say, for instance, fishermen, live bait, the transportation of live bait from one body of water to another is a big no-no, right? Because you don't know what species you have in your minnow bucket, right?
Yeah. So we actually we worked on that. So we worked on HACCP, which is the Hazard Analysis and Critical Control Point, which sounds really fancy, and it is, because it was instituted by NASA. And so it's a program that is actually used by the Ontario government, and we've worked with them very closely over the years for that, so that bait harvesters, so people who sell bait, have to develop a HACCP plan. So hazard analysis, the invasive species, critical control points. What are those points in their processes or their operation where they can limit the potential for an introduction of an invasive species? And so they have to go through this, and we educate them. So historically, Rob has done it, I've done it, has worked with the MNRF to develop these HACCP plans for those bait harvesters, so that they ultimately reduce the risk of selling invasive species to the unknowing general public. Now, that being said, that doesn't necessarily stop you as an angler from going out with your license, deploying a baited minnow trap, and potentially catching invasive species and illegally using them. And that's where it always comes back to the regulations and how people need to know the regulations, because you're not allowed to use things like round gobies as bait. You're not allowed to use them. And I've had people admit to me using round gobies as bait because they work so well. Yeah, but it's against the law. And there's a reason why it's against the law. So, you know, it's really vitally important that people learn how to identify invasive species, know the regulations, and then abide by those regulations, especially when it comes to things like bait use. And one of the things that, you know, I think is important to mention is that the Ontario government also came out with a new bait management plan. So there is new regulations for bait use in Ontario. And I don't want to get into the weeds, no pun intended, too much there, because there's a lot to digest. Essentially, just to give you the Coles notes, there are 4, I believe, bait management zones now in Ontario, and there are rules for purchasing bait, obtaining your own bait, and some of the and this is one of those examples going back to the very beginning when I described who we are as the OFAH, where we had, worked with the MNRF to try to make that as best as it could be, keeping in mind trying to protect the environment, while also providing anglers with an opportunity to use live bait, because live bait is heavily desired by anglers. Some people abhor using live bait. But at the end of the day, there are many mom and pop businesses that rely on live bait, and that's been in their family for ages to sell that. But we also need to keep in mind that we're also very fortunate in Ontario to even be able to use live bait. If you look at many of the jurisdictions around North America, live bait is banned in many places for this very reason. So if people think that these new regulations in Ontario for bait are too restrictive, just remember that we're very lucky to be able to use them in the first place. And, it's there for a reason. And the reason is we want to try to prevent the spread of invasive species such as round goby.
Right. One of the big things too is like for we'll say for fishermen. I've known a lot of fishermen to bring earthworms from southern Ontario up north to areas where earthworms are not native, right? And then they end up dumping their worm bucket in the middle of nowhere, and all of a sudden they've created a new, or could potentially create a new monster there, right? I believe even earthworms are not even native to North America. Is that correct?
Nope, they are not native to North America. I was just going to say, I don't know if I open this can of worms, but
no pun intended again.
No pun intended.
But I think, this is also a really good segue into some of the new invasive species that we are dealing with. And I think it's important that your viewers learn about this. Jumping worms are a very real threat as an invasive species in Ontario currently. And these are a particular species of worm that kind of lives up to its name, in that they kind of appear to be jumping when they are aggravated. And this was actually first brought to our attention as a program about 2 years ago when I had met with a biologist from Minnesota. She wanted to learn about the mystery snail program, which we talked about, and I wanted to learn about her jumping worm program because I had never even heard of jumping worms. And she told me that this is a species that has been causing, devastating impacts on gardeners in the state of Minnesota because people have been accidentally introducing them via purchased plants, the plant soil, into their gardens. And then these jumping worms are essentially devastating their gardens. They're depleting the soil of nutrients, and as a result, their plants are dying. So this is one that's here in Ontario, unfortunately. It has been found in the GTA and in various areas around the GTA. And we suspect that it was an accidental introduction via contaminated soil, plant soil. So we're trying to educate Ontario's public about that, to be on the lookout for jumping worms and to report sightings. And we've been working with Dr. Michael McTavish, who is kind of the, in my mind, the jumping worm expert in Ontario. So that is a species that is a very real issue for us currently in Ontario, is the jumping worm.
I'd never heard of that.
Well, there you go, right?
There you go. I'm even looking on your website. Can't find it on there either. So I'm probably just missing something because
there's a lot there. So.
Now, another one too that is always a big question, and I'm sure 99.9% of people know wood. You should not be transporting wood. You're mentioning wilting oak, I think it's called. Is that right? Wilting oak?
Oak wilt, yeah.
Or oak wilt, okay. And then you get things like, your emerald ash borer beetles, which have killed all these ash trees. Probably could still continue to live in the bark of these trees. And then us as backcountry people, or people who like to go to places like Algonquin Park or any of the provincial parks that sell you, I'm sorry, absolute crap for wood. Yeah. Yeah. And then they tell you can't bring any wood in. And I understand exactly why. But that's the thing that a lot of outdoors people like myself are faced with is, you go for a family camping trip and you go there and you spend, $12 for a bag of wood, and it's wet. The stuff is sizzling, right?
Yeah.
So, talk about the importance of not transporting wood from one area, or of the importance of purchasing wood in the area that you're actually camping in.
Well, Dennis, I actually think you just did an amazing job.
That's pretty much it.
Yeah, you nailed it.
Okay, on to the next one.
Yeah, many insects are they're bark boring insects, and will lay their larvae within the phloem of the tree, and then that can be transported, and then you could be releasing live insects. So particularly ash, right, with the emerald ash borer. So I think you nailed it. I think, it's really important that people are cognizant of that, and even just spend a little bit of time maybe even looking at the wood that they're potentially transporting to ensure. And then also just, again, knowing that there are quarantine zones in the province for the transportation of wood. So, there's a lot to digest here, and I get it, because it's multifaceted in the respect that it affects so many parts of our life, right? If you're a boater and an angler and a camper and a hunter, and you're like, holy man, I got to deal with all these different things. Like, I got to think about the boating regs. I got to think about the new bait regs. I got to think about, transporting wood and all that. And I think at the end of the day, if people just use common sense and just spend that extra 3 to 5 minutes at times thinking a little bit more critically about their impacts and what it is that they are transporting, we can make light years of difference. And I think that is so evidently clear when we think about something like clean, drain, dry. Because clean, drain, dry, it may sound arduous, but cleaning and draining takes like 5 minutes, if that. And it has a fairly high success rate in preventing the spread. I'm going to say that anecdotally, but it's based on the literature on scientific study that has been done, that it's like upwards of 90% effective in preventing the spread of invasive species. So simple actions go a long way. And I can get it. I can get that it's overwhelming, but just common sense, taking that little bit of extra time.
Right. Yeah. That's like, no, don't bring your bait up north. Don't bring your own wood up north. And the whole drain dry type of thing. Now, I'm a canoeer. I'm a paddler. There's plenty of people that are kayakers and, any other paddle sports. But typically, how long could a vessel sit outdoors, drying naturally before the threat is kind of eradicated when it comes to something like that, right?
I'll leave this to Jeff.
Sure. Yeah. So traditionally, we recommend 5 days of really consecutive sunlight. Now, obviously, 5 days of consecutive sunlight in the spring or fall, when you don't really get that, it's a little challenging, and that's why the legislation surrounding cleaning your boat doesn't necessarily mention disinfecting or killing the organisms that might be clinging to your boat. As Rob mentioned, just doing a quick due diligence thing to remove any debris, plant matter, mud, still standing water in your vessel, that's already way more effective than not doing anything. So to leave your boat in the sun for 5 days is great. Everyone should do it. But there's also a number of other disinfection tools that you can use. We have some pretty hefty pressure washing units that are pretty popular at trade shows and annual general meetings and stuff that we use to blast boats as they come out of the water, because high pressure is also another effective tool to disinfect boats. But obviously, not everyone has access to tools like that to disinfect the boats, but everyone has a couple of minutes to just give it a quick walk around and empty your transom plug, remove any of that plant or mud debris, things like that, and then you're good to go on your way.
Okay. And what are some other measures that backcountry campers, because we're not only just talking about boats, right? We have, we'll all have equipment packed in our backpacks, which are thrown on the ground, picked back up again. Sometimes you lay your backpack on the ground, and you get little creepy crawlies that crawl inside of these things, right? What are other things that we can do to help prevent the transportation of anything, right?
Number one, Dennis, is learning how to identify invasive species. I think if you learn how to identify like the basic, terrestrial plants and that kind of stuff, you'll know, oh, I'm not going to throw my gear in amongst that, right? So that'll help you just avoid it in the first place. Or, if you can identify a massive stand of Eurasian water milfoil, you're like, I'm not going to paddle through that, because I know for a fact that I'm going to chop that sucker up, and then it's going to fragment and it's going to go all over the place. So identification is so vitally important. Now, when you get into like the itty gritty around your gear, I think that you can get pretty intense. Like one of the things that we've recommended, particularly for like, let's say the MRF, because they do broad scale monitoring, they go to many different lakes in the same day, they have dedicated gear. So they'll actually use dedicated gear. They'll have gear that's dedicated to this lake, dedicated to that lake, so that they're not using the same gear between lakes, which will then, prevent the spread of something like spiny water flea, something that they can't actually see, but they know is in the water, right? So that's an example of kind of an extreme that one could take. But I think, doing very basic things to make sure there's no standing water within your gear, because when there's standing water, there could be microscopic things like zebra mussel larvae, right? Which are called veligers. You can't see them, but if you're in a lake that has zebra mussels and you take standing water from that lake, you could have zebra mussel veligers in that water. And so just, again, making sure that your gear is dry, or that you're allowing your gear the opportunity to sit in the sun for, a period of time to potentially kill any organisms that are on it. So you can go from very basic to draining the water and, giving it a visual inspection, pulling anything off, to a more intense and laborious technique, such as, even using like a chemical treatment. Like I think, Jeff, you mentioned that before. So there's all sorts of different, techniques that you can use. But again, sometimes they're species dependent, like bleach, using a bleach solution, a diluted bleach solution is actually ineffective on spiny water flea eggs. So it's like sometimes you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. So going back to common sense, spending a few minutes, just doing what you can so that at the end of the day, you don't become apathetic. Because I think many of us could just be like, holy, as I said, there's too much. I can't do it all. Thus, I'm going to do nothing. And I'm going to become apathetic. And I think that is very dangerous. So
Sure. Untamed Ontario is asking, what are some examples of invasive species that are most easily spread unknowingly?
I also saw another great question by Untamed Ontario, which was talking about natural barriers to invasive species, which might be, I might like to answer after this one.
Touch on both, sure.
Sure, but I'll let one of you guys handle this one.
I'm going to say the first one that comes to my mind for most easily spread unknowingly, definitely spiny water flea. It is in an alarming amount of lakes in that cusp of the gateway to Northern Ontario already, and it can actually remove the plankton in a lake by up to half. So that is a vital and pivotal food source for the building blocks to a lot of those aquatic food chains that is not being affected at all by, climate change, pollution. Half of the plankton in these lakes are gone because of this one invasive species.
Yeah, it's crazy. Yeah, it has major impacts on walleye growth rates. That has been researched by, I think it was the University of Minnesota. Some I think PhD students there had done a paper on the impacts of spiny water fleas on walleye, and it was surprising. It was pretty interesting stuff, and not for the good reasons. So yeah spiny water fleas, definitely.
And just to add a little more context, they're incredibly small, microscopic crustaceans. They're like a plankton, but they predate on plankton, and they're incredibly discreet, very, very hard to see, very small. And that is their discreet nature of them and why they're so easily missed. Because they cling to lines and anchor lines and stuff.
And some people might ask, well, if spiny water fleas are in and they're killing native zooplankton, and they are a zooplankton, why aren't our fish just eating those? And well, the name itself kind of answers that question. Spiny water flea, it's about 70% of its body length. Fishhook water flea, it's about 80% of its body length. And when fish are young enough that they're predating on zooplankton, they are unable to properly consume spiny water flea. Thus, it's actually a double negative in that they have not only reduced the food store for the food that the fish actually want, but then they're also wasting energy trying to consume the spiny water flea. So it's kind of a double whammy. So.
Wow, that's it all goes twofold, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it definitely does. And so real quick, I would like to answer that question because that was a really great question that I think is important for people to hear. So Untamed Ontario had asked, are there natural barriers to the spread of invasive species? And the answer is yes, right? There's climate. That's an obvious one. Like there are some tropical species that would just simply not survive in our winters. But that is also why climate change is such an issue, particularly in Ontario, where we find ourselves, because many species are maybe annual right now, but may over time, be able to overwinter in Ontario with our changing climate. Another one that comes immediately to mind are zebra mussels. There is a limiting factor for zebra mussels in our Canadian Shield. There's just simply not enough calcium carbonate for zebra mussels to develop their shells. So if you go into the Canadian Shield and you're like, I'm not really seeing any zebra mussels, well, there's a reason for that, because they require about 20 milligrams per liter of calcium carbonate to, as I said, develop their shells, but they simply can't do it because it's not present. So it's a chemical limitation within the water body itself. So there are many kind of natural, there's even physical barriers, right? The Great Lakes Fishery Commission, the GLFC, used to build physical barriers to sea lamprey. I think one of the first comments tonight was, I hope we're talking about eels tonight. So I had to bring up sea lamprey, which is a parasitic eel that clings to the side of salmonid species, so your salmon species, and basically bores through their flesh and then consumes their flesh.
Brooke, you should know better than to call lamprey eels. Come on.
Yeah. And one lamprey can actually lead to the death of about 40 pounds of salmon species in its life. So it's a species that's had a huge impact on our fisheries within the Great Lakes. But again, touching on that success story question, and what is a success? This is a species that has been, widely regarded as a success because of the level of management that it's gone through since the founding of the GLFC. And it is now at about 10% of the population that it once was. So it's been reduced by about 90% through the various methods that the GLFC has used to control them, which is like physical barriers. Because again, natural things that occur. The Niagara Falls is a natural barrier that occurs that prevents the spread of invasive species. So as I said, climate, that's kind of number one that we kind of bank on in Ontario, cold climate. But as I said, that's changing, and it could get a lot worse with those changes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So now what about in the case, I'm a fisherman. I fished Lake Erie, I fished Lake Ontario, I've been in Rice Lake, and we were talking about the round gobies and the issues there. Like I've been trolling for walleye in Lake Erie and I've caught gobies. Right? Yeah. Quite literally, like trolling along at 3.2 kilometers an hour or whatever it is, and you're pulling up gobies from the bottom. Yeah. What course of action? You're all very well aware of this issue. Mm-hmm. What do you do with the fish when you catch it? What's the proper thing to do? Obviously, you're not reintroducing it.
You're required to euthanize it. It's stated right in the fisheries regulation summary that you're not to put that fish back in the water. Right, so, okay. Humanely euthanizing a fish, you can just bonk it on its head and cut its gills, and that's considered humane.
We've heard people also say that they, spin them around and throw them to the seagulls behind them. Don't do that because you can miss and just put it back in the water. So,
right.
Not to mention, round gobies have also been linked to the spread of botulism type E in birds. So when I get a young kid who comes up to me and says at a trade show, "Oh, I catch round gobies and I feed them to the birds," and I'm like, I think this is like, there's not really much point like telling the kid, but it's like, tell the parents, try not to have them do that because they have been linked. So it's an interesting thing. It really shows you how invasive species, when they've invaded, can kind of work together in a sense, in that zebra mussels are filter feeders, right? They filter water. They filter about 1 liter of water every single day. And when they're filtering that water to feed, they're eating phytoplankton, zooplankton, and they're also consuming contaminants within that water. And then when you have round gobies, which feed on zebra mussels, you have what's called bioaccumulation, where you have these chemicals that are now going up the food chain that have gone from zebra mussels to now round gobies. And then that is then fed to waterfowl or another bird and
other game fish.
Exactly. And can lead to botulism type E in those birds, and it has caused die-offs in birds. So insane, right? Like, who could have predicted that? I don't think anybody would have necessarily predicted that, but it just shows you, how insane this world of invasive species is.
Funny thing is there's a guest who was on my show a number of years ago. He was a television professional fisherman from my area who he's quite well known. And he and I were talking, and this guy will eat any kind of fish, including gobies.
Really? Yeah. I've tried gobies. There's a common theme here amongst you. I think, like, I've eaten gobies, I've eaten Chinese mystery snails, I've eaten all sorts of so we actually got a can from, I want to say, was it like Ukrainian origin? Like, we had some form of like canned gobies many moons ago, and I think I and one other person who is no longer with UFAH tried them. And it wasn't good. It wasn't.
The smell was not good. I was not passing that past my lips. No way.
I had to be able to say I did it, right? And it was kind of like reminiscent of like cat food, but again, subjective, right? Some people might love that, well, I was not a huge fan. But yeah, I wouldn't really partake, because I would also, there is a guide to consuming fish in Ontario, and I think it's really important that people understand that
You follow that guide, right?
yeah, like there are, again, bioaccumulation. There are chemicals that are being passed up the food chain to especially our larger fish, and so I just, that's one species that I'm just like, yeah, I would never consume that from Ontario's waters.
Right. You know what? Untamed Ontario is like on fire tonight. Here's another one. Which invasive species tastes the best?
Taste the best. Garlic mustard. Because you can make a pesto, and I love pesto. I'm totally partial towards pesto. So garlic mustard, sea lamprey, they make sea lamprey pie with that. Apparently, and this is going to be a great segue, just real quick, so I want to talk about Asian carps for a minute. Apparently, Asian carps are also very palatable. They're very tasty. And there have actually been circumstances of states kind of renaming them to try to make them more palatable. Because I think we have a negative connotation associated with the word carp. So whether it's the common carp, because people think bottom feeder, right? And the Asian carps are not bottom feeders. And so as a result of that, they taste different, and they're white meat. So apparently they're very good, but they're very hard to consume because they have so many bones. So when, you have somebody from like North America who's used to a nice walleye fillet or what have you, and then they have one of these things, they're like, how do I consume this? There's just so many bones in it. So down in the States, what they'll do is they'll grind it up and turn it into like fish patties. They'll deep fry it and make it more palatable by just grinding it up. But apparently it's very tasty. And so that's my answers. I don't know if you guys have any answers for what's the most tasty.
Japanese knotweed shoots are pretty good too. If you get them just as a couple inches tall, you can fry them up with some butter. They're good too.
They're like asparagus, right? I've heard.
Yeah.
I do most of my grocery shopping at grocery stores, and I don't eat these pieces.
That's fair. Yeah, no, that's fair.
I see your graphic on there, Brooke, about identification of the carp. Can we go through that?
Yeah, please. Yeah, that'd be great. So just a little bit of background on the Asian carps. So these are 4 species. So the one at the bottom there, you might recognize, that is the European carp, so Cyprinus carpio, and that is a non-native. And I don't know if we differentiated between the two. And I think it's important that we do. I think some people would just be like, oh, well, I already know what the difference is just based on your definitions that you've already given us. But a non-native is something that didn't originate here, but isn't having the negative consequences for the ecosystems that, say an invasive species would. But as I said before, that's subjective. Depending on who you ask, people would say that common carp are invasive. But for our purposes, we track and we want people to report Asian carps, so the 4 species you see there, but not the common carp. So if you see a common carp, it's throughout Southern Ontario. It's in many of our water bodies. They spawn, every spring, and you're going to see them. So just be mindful of the fact that that's not one that we want you to report. But these species are definitely ones that we want you to report. And Dennis asked us before, what are like some of the top species that you can think of today? And these are some of them. So grass carp in particular, which is this one right here, is the one that has been showing up in Ontario's waters. We do not have a reproducing population as of right now. And since 2014, when the Asian carp crew was created out of the Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada, we have found and captured, I think it's 42 grass carp. So that sounds like a big number, but it's not. That's not a big number, but they are present. And Dennis, you said before, like, well, they're here. Like that's, and any person who, looks at this superficially from the outside, who don't deal with invasive species every day, like we do, would say like, yeah, they're here. Like obviously you're finding them. But there's a thing called arrival, survival, establishment, and spread, right? And that's how we kind of understand the introduction of an invasive species. And so they have arrived and they are surviving, right? There's no environmental, things that are keeping them in check. So what about establishment? So establishment is when they go through successive reproductive cycles. And we have not seen that yet in Ontario's waters. And the DFO is keeping a very close eye on this. And they are monitoring our major tributaries, because these species are very much like salmon species, where they'll swim up fast flowing waters to lay their eggs, and they're large eggs. They're very large. And DFO have not found any reproducing grass carp. Now, that being said, it's still an imminent threat. It is still, top of the mind priority species. So if anybody sees a grass carp, again, this one right here, you're going to want to report that, and they can get big. Like these guys can get up to like over 100 pounds in size. And the grass carp lives up to its name. It's herbivorous. It feeds on aquatic vegetation. And, the impacts associated with that are pretty huge. They're going to clear aquatic plants. And when they do so, they don't digest all of those aquatic plants. So then they're defecating nutrient-rich, feces into our water, which can actually lead to higher occurrences of algal blooms. And we know how much we all love those. So this is a species that's going to have major impacts on our waterways if allowed to establish. If you look at the case studies of the Illinois River or the Mississippi River, anecdotally, we hear from them that Asian carps make up 90% of the biomass in those rivers now. So where there was once biodiverse rivers with many different, game species or sports fish that people like to catch, now 9 out of 10 fish are Asian carps, which you're not going to catch, at least not in the conventional sense. There's ways that you can catch them, but they're very different. So, because again, it comes back to their diet, right? Like grass carp, herbivorous, big head carp, a planktivore. So it feeds on plankton, like zebra mussels. And so it's literally just filter feeding, day in, day out, feeding on our microscopic plankton. Big head carp predominantly feed on zooplankton, whereas silver carp predominantly feed on phytoplankton. So, our tiny plant organisms that are in the waterways. And then you have black carp, which is actually a molluscivore that feeds on native mollusks. And no, they will not consume zebra mussels, which people will inevitably ask. They would, however, consume native clams. And they use these massive teeth in the back of their jaws called pharyngeal teeth to crush the clams. So big nasties, we're fortunate that these three are not imminent threats, but the grass carp is. And again, I want people to be on the lookout for it. If you think you've seen one, try to snap a photo. If you caught one, keep it and get in touch with us, because DFO will go out and they will take that fish from you, as we had this summer when Jeff had a report from a gentleman at Fort Erie.
Wow.
I did try and add to the comments here the hotline number, as well as how to actually go about reporting an invasive species. So I don't know, Dennis, if maybe someone can add it to the chat, or we can just say it aloud here. Our hotline is 1-800-563-7711. You can also email us, isap@ofah.org. Or you can report it on our online program as well, edmaps.org, eddmaps.org.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, on your end, it's one thing that StreamYard doesn't have is the ability for guests to be able to post in the chat, which I think is totally ridiculous. But if you would like to put that into the private chat there, Jeff, the hotline number, and I will post it. I'll put it up.
Will do.
If Richard West wants us back, I'm sure we can come back and do another show.
Yeah, right, for sure.
And,
I'm going to pop up a couple questions here that were put forth by some of the viewers here. Let's see here. Graybeard Adventures asking, what would the panel consider to be a top 5 invasive species in Ontario?
I have my list, but I think my list may be different than the others. So let's start with you, Rob.
Okay, top 5. Number 1, Phragmites.
Yeah.
It's just widespread, dense populations. I've seen it as far north as Thunder Bay. So that's number 1. I'm a bit biased. I'll go number 2, water soldier. It's spread. It's just been a thorn in my side for so long that it's just getting number 2. Number 3, European water chestnut. Again, the only reason these species are a priority species in the province, and they need the attention. There's still hope that we can possibly eradicate it. I'm an aquatics guy, so I'm going all out for the rest of the aquatics. Eurasian water milfoil is number 4, and I'll go with curly leaf pondweed number 5, only because I like to be out on the water early, and it just mats up the water that early season when I like to go walleye fishing.
That one really surprised me. I did not expect you to say curly leaf pondweed.
It's just it annoys me.
Yeah.
It's not a big species. A lot of people probably won't have it on their list, but it personally affects me when I like to recreate.
Yeah. Jeff, do you? What about you? What's your top 5?
Yeah, I'll go oak wilt, Phragmites, and I realize this probably isn't in any particular order. Marbled crayfish, Phragmites, and spiny water flea.
Yeah. I think I would legitimately struggle only because there's like top 50 in my mind. There's so many. You'd almost have to classify it in different ways, like which ones aren't here yet, top 5. Which ones that are here, top 5. Top 5 aquatics, top 5 terrestrial. But in my mind, things like, many that you guys have already mentioned, grass carp, I think is at the top, near the top. I think frag, I'm going to put that off to the side because Phragmites European common reed is already, it's just so bad. Same with Eurasian water milfoil, it's here, it's so bad. So I'm trying to think of things that aren't here yet that we're trying to stop from getting here. Grass carp is up there. Marbled crayfish, we've had one occurrence in the province, which was definitely an aquarium release. The reason why this one's crazy, Dennis, is because it's the only known crayfish that can asexually reproduce. So it's a single female that is able to asexually reproduce. Think about the potential for populating an ecosystem. And where we're managing this species, we can attest to how fast this thing has populated the ponds that it's in. Just insane. So that one, it's kind of a sleeper, but I think it's definitely up there. It is regulated. It is prohibited in the province. Then after that, oak wilt. I think our oak trees are so vitally important in the province. Then after that, man, wild pigs, the devastation that we've seen down in the southern states, the impacts that they would have on agriculture, our ground nesting birds, on native, flora and fauna. It's just, it would be insane. And there wouldn't really be an easy fix for them either because they're so brilliant. So that's 4. And then 5, I don't know. That's a tough one. I think
Have the pigs made it to Ontario yet?
No. So I'm gonna skip out on answering number 5 in order to answer this question. So wild pigs are not yet necessarily in the province, but the thing about wild pigs that's so interesting to people is that Sus scrofa is the scientific name for pigs, right? And that applies to domesticated pigs, that applies to Eurasian boar, that applies to their hybrids. They're the same species. So much like koi, that ornamental fish, and common carp are the exact same species, but one looks different than the other, these pigs are all the same. So domesticated pigs, if allowed to free roam on our landscape and start reproducing, can become, wild pigs. And as a result, have the same impacts. So we have had cases of wild pigs roaming in Ontario, but wild pigs are now going to be prohibited as of I believe January of this upcoming year. They have been restricted, and again, if you guys want to know the differences between restricted and prohibited, look up the Invasive Species Act. But now they're becoming prohibited. So you're not allowed to introduce wild pigs or have a wild pig farm in Ontario anymore. And so we don't have an established population, but going back to the success question, this is why it's so important that we do this now, because we don't want to get them here, have them reproducing, and then go, oh crap, we got to do something about it. Like we did with zebra mussels. We need to look on the horizon, see what's there, see what the real threats are, and then say, we need to do something about it now. And that's what we're doing with grass carp. That's what we're doing with wild pigs. And that's what we're trying to do with many other species like oak wilt, spotted lanternfly, you name it.
So be proactive rather than reactive, right?
100%. Yeah, that's a perfect way of putting it.
Cool. Very cool. Untamed Ontario, once again, he should have been my co-host for tonight.
Right?
Is there such thing as a good invasive species? Species that's a benefit to the ecosystem?
So real quick, I'm sorry. I really want to answer wild pigs equals hunting opportunity. Somebody put Graybeard Adventures. I really need to answer that. And the reason being is because I'm a hunter. I've been hunting since I was 6 years old, going up with my mom and dad. I just spent 2 weeks in the field. And that's why, Dennis, I wasn't communicating because I was out deer hunting. And the thing about wild pigs is, yeah, technically they would represent a hunting opportunity. But the negative consequences of having those things will always outweigh any potential benefits of having them here. And if you look at the case studies in the States, and I sit on the National Wild Pig Committee, I guess you'd call it, And we've had presentations from folks from the States, and we had a biologist from Louisiana where there's an established population. I think it was Louisiana. This was like a year and a half ago now. And he had said, we had them in one county. And then we said, hey, we're going to bring in the hunters and help us out. And then within about 5 years, they had them in like 20 counties. The reason being is because pigs are exceptionally intelligent. And in order to eradicate a sounder, which is the name of a group of pigs, you need to capture every single one. And the way that that's done is by baited traps with a big cage above them that's on camera. And when they see that the whole sounder's in there, they trigger the trap. They trap all the pigs. They euthanize the pigs. The reason being is because the average hunter, and I can attest to this, will probably only shoot 1 or 2 pigs, and then there'll be 10 running around that are going to scatter, learn that you're shooting them in the daylight, so thus become nocturnal, and then also start to recognize, what a hunter is and what they're doing because they're that smart. And then they're going to start to reproduce. And wild pigs reach sexual maturity in 6 months, and they have 6 to 10 piglets per litter, and they're going to have 2 per year. So that's exponential growth, right? So when you're spreading them, and you do spread them as a hunter, I hate to say it. And because again, I am a hunter, and I am going to say that hunting is not the solution, unfortunately, to the wild pig situation. So it's really important that we leave this, this species up to the scientists like the MNRF. So we facilitate people reporting to us. We make sure that when a wild pig is reported, we get it to the MNRF right away so that they can investigate and then trap those pigs like they did in Pickering. I think it was 2 years ago when there was a sounder of 12 pigs that was outside of Pickering, and they captured every single one. It's really vitally important that hunters just understand that the science is not on our side in this circumstance. And that's okay, because we don't want wild pigs.
Mm-hmm. Well, so are there any good species? Invasive species?
You guys?
No, it's in the... Jeff, you're on mute. Go ahead.
I apologize about that. I was just going to say, coho salmon are not native to Ontario, right? And we work really hard to stock them so that they're utilized recreationally. So that's the separation between what an invasive species is and just an alien or non-native species, right? Is that negative connotation. And it's pretty subjective. Salmon, a good one, even rainbow trout are not native to Ontario either, right? But these are species that are obviously utilized by many in recreation. So are there any invasive species that are beneficial? No, because then they would be just, non-native or introduced species.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of answering it. I think there's some benefiting species, obviously. But by and large, it's kind of like a scale, right? As Jeff was alluding to. And obviously the negatives completely outweigh the positives with these species, hence the classification as invasive. And I also just want to say, Greybeard Adventures did say, it didn't say I wanted pigs, so I give him full credit for that. He just said it would represent a hunting opportunity. And yeah, that's true. But no, yeah, I'm glad that you identified that you don't want wild pigs, because neither do I.
Cool. Got 2 more viewer questions here, and then we'll probably call it an evening because we're getting close to that 9 o'clock hour. So Evan Lefebvre is asking, how can we get parks like Algonquin to install boot cleaning, and boat cleaning booths at popular put-ins?
That's something that we could possibly engage them with. I know that in the past, we used to have a terrestrial species liaison that would work with municipalities, get those boot cleaning stations put up in popular parks, like I believe it was the Rouge when that first opened. So it's possibly something that we could engage Parks Canada with.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
both
good
stations
idea.
are difficult.
Yeah.
You think the park
it's
themselves
great.
would probably instill something like that, though, just to try and prevent, because they're doing research in there too, right? So
Yeah.
Boat cleaning stations, the real limitation is cost. We have looked at it so many different ways, and we have looked at case studies in the States. We even almost put in applications to try to buy CD3 units, if people have ever heard of those. They're like a clean train dry unit that are from a company in the States. the cost is very restrictive when you consider what you need for these boat cleaning stations, right? The average cost down in the States for those units is 20 to 30,000 USD. And in Canada, it's unfortunately no better. So we really try to prioritize signage as a program, as a kind of a way of getting the message out there that's more economical. So we have clean, drain, dry signs up in probably thousands of locations across the province now at water access, trying to get people, because again, like the thing that about, boats in particular is the majority of the success that can be achieved there is done by you, is done by the person looking at their own boat. It's not because they need a pressure washer. It's not because they need a scrubber. It's not because they need a vacuum. It's because they just need that little bit of elbow grease to crawl under their boat, pull off a weed, or drain their bilge, or put their motor all the way down to drain the water. Like that's what we need, and that's why we prioritize the signage at boat accesses. But they're still great. We still use our pressure washing unit, but it's just very costly to upkeep. And because we have literally thousands upon thousands of lakes and water access access locations in Ontario, it's almost impossible to hit them all. And when it comes to boot scrubbers, yeah, they're much more economical. And as Rob said, we have in the past engaged with various groups. I know that we've engaged with various OFAH board groups, like zone boards, to get boot scrubbers. But, again, it's really up to what kind of priorities that park in particular is setting, right? Like what are their priorities as a park, and whether or not they're prioritizing something like that.
Sure. And we'll take one more question here to kind of close up the evening. And this comes from a good friend, somebody who usually pops into the show for a few questions. Kevin Callan over at Casey Happy Camper. He loves what you're doing, positive stuff, but he has a past history with your job.
Yeah.
And are you wasting your time, or is it a battle you can't win?
Is this Kevin Callan?
This is Kevin Callan. It is.
Yes. Kevin, I did not think you were going to be this negative. Of course we can win. Kevin was one of my professors at Fleming College, actually, many moons ago. You have to keep a positive attitude, Kevin. You know this. One battle at a time. Those little wins, right?
Yeah.
It can make a big difference.
Yeah. And somebody's got to do this job. Somebody has to be spreading the education and outreach necessary, because even if I don't see that one species not get introduced, I'm still hopeful that it's, we're having some form of positive impact. And you know what? Like, this is the single greatest job I've ever had. I've been in this program for over 8 years now, and I think the people really make the job. And I think the content, yeah, it can be glum at times, but man, have I had amazing interactions with people over the years at trade shows and out in the field. And, when I get to spend one day at my desk working on a resource dedicated to crayfishes, and then the next go down to Burlington to try to find said crayfishes and, be the first ones in North America to find them in the wild, that's pretty cool stuff. And I love it. I always will, because I'm an outdoorsman at heart. I grew up hunting and angling, and I want to protect those things that I've grown to love. And I understand that a big threat to hunting and angling are invasive species. Thus, this is where I am in my career, and I'm happy to stay here. And I've had people tell me, you need to get a different job. I've had somebody at a trade show tell me, you need a different job. And I looked them square in the eye and I said, something not nice, so we get out of here, because I love this job. So.
I think ultimately what you gentlemen and your organizations and all your volunteers are doing is detrimental, and it's having an impact, because if you weren't doing what you're doing, I'm sure it would be much worse.
Well,
the issue would be
I
much
think so.
Yeah.
Michael, yes, we are hiring. ISAP, I don't know if the job posting has closed, though. We are hiring for a 9-month contract position from January to September. So look for that on ofah.org. So if you go to www.ofah.org, you can see jobs, and keep your eyes open there. We often post jobs for ISAP. We don't, because we're not a huge organization or a huge program, we don't have a lot of core jobs. You see 3 of them here, and beyond that, we do have a lot of seasonal jobs, though. We hire hit squad staff who are staff that we hire all throughout the province that are OFH staff members, and they go out into the communities where they're hired to spread education and outreach every single year. So look for those postings, and maybe someday we'll see you on the crew.
Yep. Just going to post one really quick comment here by Steve over at Sulik 46. He says that in many national parks outside of Canada, they'll ask for boat sterilization records. I think that's, you know what? I think it's all.
Don't ask how I know.
Pardon?
Just see his comment. Don't ask how I know.
Yeah.
So. Well, and even Alberta, like, you know, Alberta has an inspection system, and Manitoba has certain areas that when you travel through, you have to have, you know, your vessels inspected. I will say, you know, in Ontario, I've only had a limited of circumstances where I've been contacted by CBSA, so Canada Border Services Agency. I have had calls from them, and they have said, I've got a boat here. It's covered in zebra mussels, you know, and they actually asked me, what am I allowed to do? And I said, well, shouldn't you be the one telling me that? So not to say anything negative about them, because they're amazing, and he did a great job in the end. But, you know, we need more of that, I think, in the province of Ontario. But I think the scale of Ontario, I'm just not sure if there'd be much of an appetite for it because of the amount of capacity that it would require. So I'm not making excuses. I'm trying to be a realist. I also agree with you. We need inspections, but I'm just not sure how realistic they are depending on who you ask.
Cool. Gentlemen, thank you very much for sharing some of your knowledge. I know we only touched the very tip of the iceberg today with this here. Never know. There could be a follow-up show. It looks like a few people are saying they'd like to hear more information on this, but there are ways that they can get more information on this, and maybe you could tell them how.
Jeffrey, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, of course. So people can call us at the hotline, 1-800-563-7711. It doesn't have to be specific to just reporting an invasive species. If you just have a question, if you're curious about something, getting some resources, please give us a call. We man that phone all week. Normal business operating hours, and then we take the messages in the morning the next day. So call us anytime. You can also email us ISAP, ISAP at ofah.org to email us for any inquiries as well. My email is Jeff_Berthelette at ofah.org as well. And feel free to reach out to me directly with any questions pertaining to, you know, having a talk, organizing any events, anything like that.
Cool. And just so everybody knows, we have links to the organization's websites and social media feeds. Check them out. That's all found down below in the description. So by all means, if you want to get yourself more information, and also check out the Ontario Invading Species Awareness Program website, because there's so much information on there, and some great word on there on how to identify some of the issues out there, and plants and animals and things of that sort. So,
and Dennis, if I could just say one more thing, just remember, folks, that the OFH is a membership organization. We exist because of like-minded individuals such as yourselves who have become members of our organization and have advocated for programs such as ours. So, you know, I think it's like $25 a year for the digital membership. It means a lot when people join the OFAH and become a member of our organization, who then, you know, have a voice in these conservation issues such as invasive species, or, you know, trying to reintroduce species like wild turkeys, which we participated in many, many moons ago, or elk, or Atlantic salmon. You know, those are the things that are meaningful to us as an organization. And we can't do that unless we have members who back us to do that.
There you go. There you go. Brooke, Jeff, Robert, thank you very much for your time tonight. And I'm sure we'll stay in touch.
Awesome, Dennis.
Thank you, Dennis.
For the opportunity.
Thank you, guys.
See you in the green room, fellas. All righty. Hopefully everybody enjoyed this show tonight. And you know what? Like me, learned a whole bunch. There's so much, like I said, that they're just barely touching on here. Tip of the iceberg when it comes to invading species, and always great to educate yourself to know what you can do. Every little bit helps. Every little bit helps when it comes to this. So do your part. Do your part. Do it the right way. Just put a bit of thought into it, and things will be good. hopefully in the end, right? Just as a reminder, next week we will have our 4th annual winter camping episode. If you're planning on doing any winter camping this year, you might want to tune in on this one because we're going to share all kinds of gear tips, tips on how to stay warm, and a bunch of how-tos just to keep you warm and comfy and safe out there in the backcountry. With all that being said, we'll see you all next week. Hope everybody has a great week. And remember, please do keep the adventures alive. Cheers.